March the 8th, 2003. The Brewers Fayre pub restaurant in Springcroft, Baillieston is packed. Families are enjoying their meals. Regulars are watching Scotland play Wales in the Six Nations. The final scores from the Old Firm match roll in. Celtic has beaten Rangers 1-0. No one notices a man in a grey hoodie and jeans walking in. He moves with purpose. Some will later recall a crumpled black plastic bag perched on his head. He strides straight to the bar, where Billy McPhee is sat on a stool, eyes fixed on the screen. Without hesitation, the man pulls out a long-bladed knife and drives it into McPhee's neck. Panic erupts, children scream. McPhee, a feared enforcer for crime boss Tam the licensee McGraw, is butchered. 27 stab wounds, his blood pooling on the floor. The killer bends down, retrieves the blade and walks out, calm, unbothered. This isn't a pub brawl, it's an execution. The suspect? Mark Clinton, a man who lived by the blade and once bragged that stabbing someone was the easiest thing in the world. He was arrested, but just one day into the trial, he walked free.
14 months of police harassment for nothing. Convicted me of murder, and the lure wasn't me. Try to convict me of murder.
How did he get away with it? And how did he become one of Scotland's most feared gangland enforcers? Mark Clinton's path to notoriety began long before he became one of Glasgow's most feared enforcers. Born and raised in the East End, he grew up in Carlton, a world where violence was a way of life. This area had a shockingly low life expectancy, as people suffered from heart diseases, unemployment and violence. While it was difficult to find a way out of this world, Clinton never looked for one. He was a product of his environment. The streets of Glasgow were divided by territorial gangs, and survival depended on how quickly someone could assert dominance. Clinton was a quick learner. By his early teens, he was already making a name for himself. He wasn't just another young thug looking to impress older criminals. He had an edge. His first arrest came before he turned 18. Knife attacks, violent robberies, and intimidation tactics became his signature. Unlike others who may have started with petty theft and moved up gradually, Clinton's rise was built on direct, unrelenting violence. He had no hesitation, no second thoughts. If someone owed money, he collected it. If someone disrespected him, they paid for it in blood. Prison was inevitable. He spent much of his early adulthood being in the news for assaults and knife-related crimes. This reputation solidified his place in Glasgow's underworld. Inside, he was feared just as much as he was on the outside. That reputation made him valuable. Gangsters needed men like Clinton. Not every debt could be settled with a polite warning. Not every rival could be scared off with a simple threat. Sometimes a message had to be sent, and Clinton was the kind of man who delivered those messages. With all that value, he became an asset for Paul Ferris, a renowned name in the Glasgow Gangland that still makes headlines every once in a while. Paul Ferris's story starts in the late 20th century Glasgow, when the city was shaped by violence. Generations of gangland feuds had left a legacy of bloodshed, backstabbings and unsolved assassinations. It wasn't just crime, it was an underworld structure, one that operated alongside the city's everyday life. The East End and its surrounding neighbourhoods were strongholds for organised crime. Disputes over money, territory and personal vendettas were settled in the streets, often with knives. Glasgow had the highest rate of knife crime in Western Europe. Firearms were used sparingly, too loud, too easy to trace. A blade was quick, silent and left a message. At the top of the city's criminal hierarchy sat Arthur Thompson. For decades, he was Glasgow's undisputed crime boss, the man everyone feared, respected or answered to. His empire was built on extortion, narcotic trafficking and connections that went beyond the underworld. Then there was Tam, the licensee McGraw, a name that carried weight not just in criminal circles, but also in whispers of police protection. McGraw was known for avoiding convictions, leading to speculation that he had deep ties within law enforcement. He controlled large portions of Glasgow's narcotic trade, bringing in millions. Paul Ferris was once Thompson's enforcer, a trusted lieutenant known for his precision in violence. He was a violent man by his own admission. And then there was Mark Clinton. Clinton, who claimed stabbing someone was the easiest thing in the world to do. He boasted that he once stabbed someone so hard the blade snapped. Once he claimed to have sliced open a man's stomach. But Clinton's story would not be complete without shedding light on Ferris's gangland endeavours. Clinton first met him when Ferris left canteen food at his door. This was the beginning of their bond that only grew stronger with time, but Ferris's story goes way back. As the East End godfather, Arthur Thompson took him under his wing. His criminal pursuits grew exponentially.
John.
How you doing, man?
How are you doing? Pleased to meet you. Pleased to come. Yeah.
Paul Ferris became the Godfather's most fierce enforcer and debt collector. His activities brought him the nicknames The Wee Man, Lucky and The Robot. But none of these names matched those given to his mentor, with whom he called the last Godfather in real terms. A reporter once called him a weasel-faced crook with cunning beyond his years. Nevertheless, Paul Ferris had fallen apart with Thompson Sr.'s son, Arthur Thompson Jr., known as the Fat Boy. While Arthur Jr. believed himself to be the heir to the Underworld throne, he didn't command respect or authority like the Godfather. As Ferris worked for Thompson Sr. as a brutal enforcer, he started inviting coppers' attention. At the age of 21, he was wanted in connection with over a dozen eliminations. His boss's family holiday home in Rothesay became his sanctuary. However, the coppers found him as well as a bag full of smack, a weapons cache and used banknotes. Ferris believes that the Fat Boy had set him up. Ferris stopped working for the Thompsons. As it turns out, Thompson Sr. had informed on him. Here is what Ferris had to say about his association with the Godfather.
Paul Ferris quickly impressed the Godfather. He became Thompson's most feared debt collector and enforcer. His exploits earned him the nicknames The Wee Man.
But the story didn't end here. In fact, it ended up in Scotland's longest gangland trial. What happened was an attempt on the Godfather 5 years after Ferris's encounter with the police. Thompson told the coppers that Ferris had attempted to take him out multiple times. 1 year later, Fat Boy Thompson got out of jail, but only to die after. Reportedly, he had had a hit list that had Ferris's name on it fourth. Whatever his intentions were, only 4 hours after declaring the hit list bearing 12 names, he was taken out. Guess who was charged with the elimination? Paul Ferris. What's more, Ferris's two close friends, Bobby Glover and Joe Hanlon, were taken out while Ferris was behind bars. They were believed to have helped Ferris in the Fat Boy's elimination. Their bodies had been left in Hanlon's car on a section of the route Fat Boy's funeral cortege was to pass. They'd been shot once in the head and then, for good measure, in the anus, in what has since become known as the Glasgow send-off. This was 1991. Ferris believed that Tam McGraw, another gangster working for Thompson, was behind his friends' deaths. It wasn't going unanswered. The Godfather died in 1993 from a heart attack. Gangsters from all over the UK attended his funeral, all but Ferris. Now the position for the crime lord had opened up, only to be filled by either Ferris or Tam the licensee McGraw. After the longest gangland trial, Ferris was cleared of the elimination.
Like an accountant, but gangster Paul Ferris is one of the most feared men in Scotland. He has been a hitman, drug dealer and gunrunner, and has carried out shootings, stabbings, kneecappings and scalpings.
But he wasn't that lucky after 5 years when he was incarcerated for arms running. His enmity with McGraw had only grown further in this time. Tam earned the moniker the licensee because he managed to evade conviction, investigation and prosecution for his crimes for over 20 years. It seems like he was licensed to commit crime, hence the nickname. This is strange though, a notorious gangland figure not having any major conviction despite operating for only 20 years, don't you think? In 1998, he was cleared of operating an international narcotic smuggling ring. That's when Paul Ferris was sent to jail for 10 years over arms trafficking. Now that Ferris was out of the picture, McGraw took over Glasgow's booming narcotic empire. While this was enough to make them enemies, Ferris and McGraw's hostility was older than that. Nevertheless, in January 2002, Ferris got out of jail and found Tam McGraw as Scotland's richest gangster. It was time for a showdown between two of the most powerful gangsters of the time. After Ferris's release, war erupted on the East End streets. The death toll was increasing, as was the licensee's vulnerability. A few drivers, minders and a guard were taken out in a bid to target McGraw. Now coming back to our protagonist, who do you think conducted these executions? Mark Clinton. He was implicated in several eliminations of McGraw's henchmen. He managed to get to McGraw in 2002 when McGraw was driving alone. He stopped by a car with Paul Ferris and Mark Clinton in it. McGraw hit them with a golf club but suffered 14 stab wounds to arms and shoulders from Clinton's thin blade knife. However, he survived the attack all thanks to his bulletproof waistcoat and, eventually, Ferris came out losing from it. He was out on licence in an arm-running charge and had to go back to jail to serve his remaining sentence. Mark was also charged with stabbing one of McGraw's most trusted lieutenants 27 times.
So how many of those wounds did you have?
15 or something like that.
15?
Just slash marks like that.
This was in March 2003, and that man was Billy McPhee, a gangster responsible for at least 6 eliminations. He had been shot in the face earlier. He had just come out after that attack and was feeling vulnerable. He knew he was in the crosshair of the ongoing feud. Known as Billy the Iceman McPhee, he was a brutal hitman, a major narcotic dealer, and a dead man walking after the feud began between Ferris and McGraw. In 1998, McGraw and McPhee both walked free from court where they faced narcotic charges. He was believed to be one of the licensee's most trusted associates. McPhee was told he was about to meet his end at another McGraw associate and close friend Gordon Ross's funeral. After the funeral, McPhee decided to go to a Rangers game and then a rugby match. He didn't survive the rugby match. The reason McPhee went to the match despite receiving threats was it being McGraw's territory. Nevertheless, he was stabbed right in the middle of the pub. The attack was brutal, leaving 27 wounds on his body. He was rushed to the hospital, but he had succumbed to his injuries. According to many, the assailant, sporting a grey hooded top and jeans, didn't even try to hide his face. This bloodied frenzy happened in the middle of a packed family pub. The customers witnessed the assailant stab McPhee in the throat and eyes. Imagine the trauma they left with. You're not going to believe what happened next. Despite the attack happened in a pub full of people and the assailant's face was clearly visible, only a few witnesses came forward. The CCTV was broken, and the killer had left other people's hair and blood on the crime scene to deceive the police. Nevertheless, Clinton was already implicated in other attacks on McGraw's gang. This attack had his name written all over it, leading to an elimination charge on him. However, Clinton denied the charge. "I was put on this because they needed someone. There are so many people who could walk into a pub, follow a gang full of so-called enemies, and take them all out in front of their pals. Maybe 2 or 3 people against an entire set. They've done that before, and one of them's in prison," said Clinton. He walked scot-free after the elimination trial collapsed. The testimony came from 2 eyewitnesses, David Hart and Henry Carey. According to Carey, he saw the assailant walk into the pub wearing a black plastic bag on his head and maintained that the attack was conducted in silence. He said he was 60% sure that the accused, i.e. Clinton, was the assassin, but admitted that he could be mistaken. However, he approached the police a few weeks before the trial and told them that he might have made a mistake. As for Mark Clinton, he filed 2 defences. One, that he was at someplace else at the time. The other, that the attack was carried out by 3 men, one of whom was of Arab origin and unarmed. Interestingly, a news report from that time cites an Underworld source calling Clinton a low-level thug. It's hard to believe he was capable of taking out McPhee. That's interesting, because a documentary and even a film portrayed him as a notorious enforcer, while another news report cited him as a low-level thug. That seems to be the case with every other criminal. Some publications portray a gangster as a kingpin or a notorious thug, while others consider them as low-level criminals. However, Clinton's actions proved that he was capable of such crime.
Mark Clinton's trial started a year after McPhee's death. If found guilty, Clinton would be facing life behind bars.
Notably, if Clinton wasn't cleared of McPhee's death, he would have been imprisoned for life. After his elimination trial collapsed, there was no statement from the police. It showed that they believed him to be the culprit, but Clinton had another story about his trial. According to him, Tam licensee McGraw made him an offer to set up Paul Ferris for execution, and they'll make sure he walks free. Mark Clinton had walked free from an elimination trial, but his days of violence weren't over. However, he was at the receiving end of that violence too.
How many murders have the police called you in on?
4, maybe 5, past 2 years.
What's it like to stab a man?
While he was surrounded by many violent incidents, he came to the police's attention again, but this time for narcotics. They discovered huge amounts of narcotics in his brother's house. However, they didn't charge the brother or his wife, pinning it on him. "It's not my house. I don't know how they can pin that on me. I'm not the householder. I don't have keys to the house," said Clinton in a documentary. At that point, Clinton was under pressure from every side. On one side, the Underworld gangsters were after him, whereas on the other, the police were after him. While he was planning to flee the town, he decided to have a farewell drink, and this decision proved to be one of his worst. Along with his associates, he went up to Glasgow's newest strip club, Legs & Co. On the wee hours of Sunday morning, he got into an incident, then ended up with him lying bleeding and unconscious on the pavement. He was rushed to the hospital, but he went into a coma. His brother was expecting the worst, but 3 days later, Mark Clinton was back on the streets. Soon after, Tam McGraw was convicted, but not for what you're thinking about. Neither for execution nor for narcotics. McGraw had a brush with the law for drunk driving. Coming back to Mark Clinton, by 2005 he was back behind bars, sentenced to 6 years for carrying a knife and threatening workers at a building site. The conviction didn't surprise anybody. Clinton had never stayed out of trouble for long. Prison didn't change him. He was released in 2009, but within months he was arrested again, this time for associating with known criminals. He was sent back inside, this time for breaking his release conditions. It wasn't until November 2010 that he finally walked free. By then, the Glasgow Underworld had shifted. Old alliances had fractured, new faces had taken over. Clinton had spent years in and out of prison, but his reputation hadn't faded. He still carried the scars of his violent past, both on his body and in his mind. He had lived a life filled with bloodshed, and that life had left its mark. Then, in January 2019, it ended. Clinton was found dead in a flat in Paisley, Renfrewshire. He was 48 years old. There were no signs of foul play. Police ruled out suspicious circumstances, but his death raised questions. Had years of fighting and prison sentences finally caught up with him? Had he been struggling with the weight of his past? In the underworld, tributes poured in. Despite his fearsome reputation, many remembered him as fearless but lovable, a man who had lived by the knife and ultimately died with his secrets. His final chapter ended quietly, far from the chaos and violence that had defined his life, but his story remains one of Glasgow's most notorious, a tale of brutality, survival, and a trial that left more questions than answers. Some men in the underworld are untouchable. Clinton wasn't one of them. The people he had crossed over the years still wanted revenge, and in Glasgow, rivalries don't fade. They just get passed down. Did someone finally catch up with him? His death in 2019 didn't come with the headlines of a hit job, but that doesn't mean he wasn't living under constant threat. Maybe the feud had died down over time. Maybe the new generation of gangsters had bigger concerns. Or maybe Clinton's death in a Paisley flat was just the quiet end to a violent life, one when the fighting stopped because there was nothing left to fight over. No official foul play was recorded, but in a world where scores are settled quietly, not everything makes the papers. For some people, despite the official stance, Mark's death was foul play. Somebody had got to him and finally achieved what many gangsters in the noughties couldn't. Mark Clinton spent years dodging prison, dodging enemies, and dodging death.
There's so many people that would brazenly walk into a pub and follow a full gang of so-called enemies and take the main man out.
In the end, he only managed to outrun 2 of them. There were no headlines about revenge, no speculation about who might have wanted him gone. It was just a quiet end to a violent life. For a man who once called stabbing someone the easiest thing in the world, his own death was the one thing that left more questions than answers. Mark Clinton's death in 2019 was not just the end of a man, it was the closing of a chapter of a violent era of Glasgow's underworld. His name had been tied to bloodshed, gangland feuds and knife crime, but in the end he slipped away quietly, with none of the chaos that once defined him. Unlike the brutal executions of past gangsters, Clinton's final moments were uneventful. No high-profile investigations, no gangland messages, no headlines of retribution. His enemies outlasted him, and the world simply moved on. Yet, while Clinton is gone, Glasgow's underworld remains as ruthless as ever. New figures take the places of old ones, and grudges from decades past still linger in the shadows. Maybe Clinton was a man who outlived his purpose, a name from another time that no longer mattered, or maybe someone ensured he would never talk. Whatever the truth is, one question remains. Was his death just bad luck? Or was it the final move in a game that never really ended?